Between 1804 and 1806, Meriwether Lewis and William Clark led the most famous journey of exploration in American history. Commissioned by President Thomas Jefferson to investigate the vast and virtually unknown Louisiana Territory, Lewis and Clark pioneered the first mapped route across North America. Along the way, besides making contact with dozens of Native American tribes and providing the first scientific descriptions of hundreds of plants and animals, they discovered the sources of the Missouri River, mapped passes over the northern Rocky Mountains, and reached the Pacific Ocean. Last month, I decided to follow the most difficult part of Lewis and Clark's journey, from the upper Missouri River in what is now North Dakota to the western slope of the Rocky Mountains in modern Idaho. The Corps of Discovery, the formal name of the Lewis and Clark expedition, set out from St. Louis in May 1804. Over the following 6 months, they worked their way up the Missouri River to the villages of the Mandan tribe in what is now central North Dakota, where they spent the winter in a stockade. Although the fort is long gone, a replica stands near the original site. It's closed during the winter, as I confirmed after wading through knee-deep snow, but fortunately, the Lewis and Clark Interpretive Center in nearby Washburn was open, and I spent a pleasant half hour there retracing the expedition's journey. On April 7, 1805, the Corps of Discovery, 33 people and 1 dog, in 6 canoes and 2 pirogues, launched into the cold water of the Missouri. The previous summer and autumn, they had come, by Clark's estimate, 1,600 miles upstream from St. Louis. They had another 1,000 miles to go on the Missouri, and, after that, the terrible challenge of the mountains. Long sections of the upper Missouri River have been dammed, but near the North Dakota-Montana state line, where the Yellowstone River joins it from the south, the Missouri looks much as it did when Lewis and Clark passed by. I walked out on the ice for a quick video. Then I followed the river into Montana, driving on US 2, the High Line, the 2-lane highway that runs forever across the northern plains. Besides a few half-empty towns and distant bluffs, there was nothing to see but infinite, snow-covered prairie. Partly for a change of scenery, I stopped briefly at Fort Peck Dam, the first of the great dams across the Missouri. From an overlook, I watched a pickup drive over the frozen reservoir, 100 feet or so above the flooded channel of the river followed by Lewis and Clark. Normally, the Corps of Discovery traveled about 20 miles a day up this stretch of the Missouri, poling and towing the boats wherever the current was too strong for rowing. There were, however, some delays, most notably at the confluence of the Missouri and Maria's rivers. Since the two were about the same size, it wasn't clear which was the Missouri, and both had to be scouted. My own progress, fortunately, was unimpeded. I spent a night in Havre before continuing southwest on US 87, again paralleling the Missouri. Along the way, I detoured down to the Ryan Dam, built atop the first of the cataracts that gave the city of Great Falls its name. The interpretive center in town described how Lewis, who had been scouting ahead, reached the Great Falls of the Missouri on June 13, 1805. He and Clark had been warned that there was white water ahead, but they had not anticipated 5 separate waterfalls in a short stretch of river. Portaging the heavy canoes and supplies 18 miles over the steep hills surrounding the falls took 11 days, and problems with the boats caused additional weeks of delay. It was mid-July by the time Lewis and Clark resumed their journey upstream, toward the mountains growing ever larger on the western horizon. My own westward trek was complicated by a gale-force wind, which whipped blinding clouds of snow across the road. But eventually, I made my way to the forks of the Missouri, where 3 mountain streams converge to form North America's longest river. Lewis and Clark reached this point in late July. After some deliberation, they decided to follow the stream they called the Jefferson, which seemed to lead more directly toward the looming mountains. They hoped to find the Shoshones, the tribe to which Sacagawea, the only woman in the expedition, belonged. 5 years before, when she was about 12, she had been captured by a war party, brought east, and eventually married to Toussaint Charbonneau, a Canadian fur trapper based in the Mandan villages. During the winter of 1804-5, Lewis and Clark had hired Charbonneau, largely because he was a package deal with Sacagawea, who knew the Shoshone language and could translate if they met members of her tribe. It was critically important that they did, since only the Shoshones knew the passes over the mountains west of the Missouri headwaters. Fortunately, just as the river they were following dwindled to a brook, the Corps of Discovery encountered the Shoshones. In an incredible stroke of luck, the Shoshone chief turned out to be Sacagawea's brother, who agreed to guide Lewis and an advance party over the mountains. Although part of their route, over Lemhi Pass, is closed by snow in the winter, I was able to follow half of Lewis's path over the mountains on a potholed gravel road. That road brought me to Leodore, Idaho, a short distance south of where Lewis first ascended the western side of the Continental Divide. The scenery was spectacular, but for the Corps of Discovery, who had expected to find only a single range of mountains, it must have been dispiriting. Worse still, the river on the far side of the mountains, now named the Salmon, was too rough to raft. So Lewis and Clark had no choice but to walk along the shore, following the river up to its sources in the next mountain range. I paralleled their route along the frozen Salmon all the way to the river's headwaters and Lost Trail Pass above. At the crest, I plunged waist-deep in snow while trying to capture a panorama of the surrounding peaks. On the north side of the pass, Lewis and Clark continued along the Bitterroot River until, on September 9th, they reached a pleasant, shady spot they called Traveler's Rest, where they recuperated for a few days. Thanks to a raw wind, the Traveler's Rest campsite, a short distance from modern Missoula, was rather less pleasant during my visit. But I dutifully followed the interpretive trail, which circles the exact location of the campsite, confirmed by traces of medicinal mercury in the soil around the site of the latrine. The Corps of Discovery had to cross one more mountain range, this time in the teeth of a snowstorm that covered the trail and soaked the men. It was only in late September that they finally descended to the Valley of the Columbia and had a clear path to the Pacific. I diverged from the expedition's path at Traveler's Rest and continued straight west. The Columbia River, dammed and managed, has changed considerably since the early 19th century. So, of course, has most of the Pacific coast. But there are places, like the rugged beach and sea stacks of Ecola State Park, that still look much as they did in 1805 when Lewis and Clark finally sighted the sea. Check out the other videos on this channel for more journeys into the past.